in our last explorations of Buddhism and ecology, we were working with the category of self and other, and all the different complicated ways that our worldview and the paradigms that our societies are built around are making a strong break and separation between the two. So we have us versus them as a consequence of that. We have this idea of humans and nature as if we were two separate things. And it's striking sometimes to hear in circles where we're talking about ecology and wanting to, reconnect, that we still are using these two categories as if they were separable, us and nature, which is out there. And so along with that, we've also seen that there is this separation that often we experience as an opposition between the personal or the individual and the collective. And how problematic that is for us in our lives, with our longing for connection, for our longing to belong to something, with our longing to maintain our wholeness, but also feel that we're part of something larger than ourselves. And on a very sort of personal level, this longing, I think, does drive a lot of spiritual seeking and spiritual practice. And that's just something, for each of us to wonder about, is that the longing? Is that motivating what I'm doing here? And if that's the case, how am I doing in meeting that longing that is driving me quietly? And at the same time, we see the problematic nature of the distinction between personal and collective in so many of the social struggles, in the way that we approach the ecological crises that I hear inside my home cannot have much of an impact with my small choices and how I manage my personal decisions, as if that were something separate from the collective. And the need for us to act with an awareness of ourselves as part of a movement, part of a collective, that we are generating cumulative effects continuously, even though we experience ourselves as it's just me putting my plastic bottle here versus there, or it's just me deciding on where to, what mode of travel to use for my next vacation, as if these were separate things, right? And part of what I've been exploring, this question whether Buddhism has resources, has an alternate paradigm. What can we recover from that mode of understanding ourselves as interdependent, and the entire corpus of practices that have been designed and refined over the centuries or millennia to get us to experience ourselves as interdependent, to get us to know ourselves as interdependent, and finally to get us to act according to values, principles, modes of conduct that reflect our interdependence. And, in a way that perspective does open one possibility, which is for us to see that this particular trajectory that human consciousness and human society has evolved along is not the only mode of relating or experiencing ourselves in our relationships to others. Right? That we could see that, we can identify many different points in history and think, gosh, if that hadn't been the model that we use to understand ourselves, what other routes might we have taken? And, one example that comes to mind for me is the idea of a social contract. How powerful an organizing idea that is, that I give up certain things because there's a social contract, which assumes that if I'm left to my nature or my devices, I'm going to do things that, are against the welfare of the collective, and I need to be induced or bribed or motivated or somehow socialized into something that works better in the collective. But what's behind the idea of a social contract? Who enters into a contract? And this is one of the arguments that's very powerful in some of the reparations work and some of the work that indigenous communities, Native American communities are saying. You signed a treaty with us. You recognized us as an autonomous, independent entity, and you entered into a treaty agreement with us. What that means is you recognized that there are two wholes. So the social contract assumes that there's us here and then there's society over there, and we can enter into a contract with it. So again, these are ways that we are applying this category of self and other that then sets in motion certain modes of understanding ourselves, of our experiencing ourselves, of building up our institutions, of building our economy, of building out our imagination. And the global culture that we have now is, of course, a historical product in which all of this trajectory has resulted, not the necessary and natural and only place that humans could have gotten to at this point in planetary history, but this is where we are based on using and applying certain paradigms that have been powerful for our self-understanding and for our way of organizing. And so the question that we have, I think, if people who are trying to look at the mega crises and trying to look at this and trying to think about, yes, where did we go wrong, but also like, what can we do? Can we respond from a different place? That sense that, if we're only drawing on the same paradigms and the same modes of thinking and the same forms of relationship that got us into this, that's not drawing on our best intelligence to think about how we could do things differently. And so the idea that we've been exploring is that undoing our thinking, and this is fundamental to Buddhism, undoing our mode of thinking is part of the work of liberation. It's part of the work of awakening. It's part of the work of radically transforming the world that we have created, because we created it based on certain ways of thinking and relating, right? And when we're in the Mahayana and Madhyamaka path that we've been locating ourselves in the previous talks, the really an illuminating insight that we can take is that these both need to be done together. The work on self and the collective work. That our process of awakening is not something that we can turn our back on the world and leave the world to its own devices, and I'm just going to work on myself and think that we're going to become fully awakened in a normative Buddhist context. Because the teaching is saying we are interdependent. If we're only thinking about ourselves, we're not using the kind of thinking that gets us liberated. And also, the reason for doing this cannot just be our own well-being. That is more of the form of limited self-centered thinking that has, constructed the problem that is causing suffering. And so there's, we've had these like philosophical discussions, and we've come at this from different angles. And I think, one really important question that I'm sure we've all had at different points, and that really does need to be central, is how, okay, the philosophical paradigm, yeah, that's interesting. But how do we experience ourselves as not other to what we have become accustomed to thinking of as other? Can we experience ourselves as not other to our non-human kin? Is that possible for us? And within the world of Buddhist practices, the answer is yes, we can. Can we experience ourselves as not other to the natural world that we are part of? Can we experience that not otherness? And there are Buddhist practices that really, if you look at them, they seem to be designed to get us to overcome the experience of ourselves as a separate, limited, autonomous self. That's what Buddhist practice is about. That's one of the things Buddhist practice is about. And so, to put this back into Buddhist terms, we are thinking about ourselves when we think about not self, teachings on not self. Where we want to go with this is, when we say not self, it doesn't mean I'm nobody. It means I am not other to what is not self. I am not other to what I don't normally consider to be myself. Are you with me? Is this making sense? And one, very simple way to put this, again, in sort of Buddhist philosophical terms, is that what we call self is made up of non-self elements. So a person is made up of non-person elements. Can we experience that? And by experiencing it, can we experience our relationships in a fundamentally different way? And, when we think about experiencing ourselves as made up of elements that are not self, when we think about the elements that make us up, and there are two important lists that I want to look at from Buddhism about the elements or the aggregates that make up the self. When we look at that, we are looking at elements that are not me, they're not mine, they belong to everyone. They belong to everything. They are collective. And the practices that are inviting us into this space where we can experience that could be powerful tools in this work of trying to reconfigure our paradigm. If we can experience ourselves as not fundamentally other to the non-human world, the doorway is open to a completely different mode of acting, of being, and of experiencing, and of relating. And so one very important place where this kind of practice is available is in what's called the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. So for Pali speakers, that's the Satipatthana Sutta, is the discourse on the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, which is the most studied sutra or sutta in the Pali Canon. It is fundamental, it is foundational. And the Four Foundations of Mindfulness are applying mindfulness in mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of sensations or feelings, mindfulness of consciousness, and mindfulness of dharmas. Okay? Where we have something that I think that I want to really try and work with as a meditation technique to move us into this space of experience is in mindfulness of the body. So the section on mindfulness of the body has a number of different techniques in the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. You practice mindfulness on the body by focusing on the breath, by focusing on physical postures, by focusing on activity, physical actions that you can do, by mindfulness of the parts or the organs of the body, And then you come in certain orders. This is practiced in different orders in different traditions, but in the most common Pali order, you come to mindfulness of the body through reflecting on the four elements. Okay, and then there's a final one where you go after that. And so when you are practicing on the four elements, the four elements of the body, where this is a classical Sanskritic Indian understanding of four elements, which lo and behold can be found in many, many indigenous systems. It's earth, fire, air, or sometimes it's translated as wind, and water. And the orders the order is not fixed. More common is earth, water, fire, and wind or air. And there are lots of presentations of the four elements in Vajrayana practices. They're associated with four directions, with four different colors. They're used in a somewhat more shamanic way of practicing that has crossovers with some indigenous traditions. In this foundation, the four foundational mindfulness, the meditation on the four elements, I'm just going to read the passage where the Buddha is addressing himself to monks, and that is significant, or monastics. He says, one reviews the body as consisting of elements in this way. In this body, there is the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element, just as a skillful butcher who has just killed a cow and is seated at a crossroads with it carved up into pieces, reviewing that body. So this obviously is suggesting moving in a somewhat different direction than feeling our connectedness with the elements in all of the world. And it is not, I think, surprising that the next step in this order, after meditating on the body as four elements, the next step is to meditate on the body as a corpse, a decaying corpse. So we're moving kind of away from life into death with a practice that is designed for celibate monastic practitioners whose practice involves a certain reworking of the relationship with the body that looks a lot like detachment or disconnection. And that's not the result that one wants. One wants to be without desire, but there's a very long detour that one finds in a lot of monastic practices, which is before you get to lack of desire, you pass through revulsion or disgust or aversion for the body. And it, easily can result in a kind of dissociation. So the practice that we are looking for, and this is consciously, we are looking for practices within the almost infinite range of Buddhist practices that can take us where we are identifying that we need to go. This is us as mature adult practitioners looking at where we're going, looking at what we need, looking at the moment and what the world needs from us at this moment, and thinking, okay, we need to know how to connect. We need to reawaken a sense of kinship with others. We need to look at how we're managing particular relationships. And yes, we need to look at a world in which dissociation from the body, we are in a physical place. We are completely absorbed in looking at our phone. We are completely disconnected from our surroundings. That is the moment. That is very much of this moment, is to have a very complicated and dissociative tendency in our relationship to place, in relationship to ourselves, in relationship to our environment. And so part of the work that a serious focus on these intersections between Buddhism and ecology invite is to think, how can we reestablish a sense of ourselves as part of the system, of something in the ecosystem, not something detached and irrelevant to its environment and the environment irrelevant to it because I'm focused on something else, but how can I experience myself as embodied here, now, real and connected? And when we take some of the ways that the four elements can be experienced in our body, when we look at our body as made of these four elements, we are not disconnecting from others and saying, I'm this. We are using the elements, using our direct experience of the elements in ourselves and the awareness that the elements, these four elements, are in everything, in a way that allows us to connect to others. And has this potential to soften or dissolve that category of otherness. And that's where we want to try to get. Can we experience ourselves as not other to the rest of the non-human world that we are part of, human and non-human world? And so the four elements, that when we work with them in this understanding, the earth element, we're referring to that sense of solidity, or density. And we experience the earth element through our bodies as gravity. And this sense that the fact that there is the earth element in everything. So there's also earth element in air and in water. They all the four elements come together. They're not, it's not the earth is non-water, non-fire, non-air. They do combine. That's the whole idea. But we are using these four categories that we can identify as a way to experience ourselves as fundamentally inseparable from everything else that has those elements. So the earth is one element. The next one is water. And water, of course, the water element shows up in our body as fluidity. And we know that we're made, principally of water. The other element in the water element that shows up and that we connect with in this practice is cohesion. So in this presentation, and it's a very classical presentation, water, what we notice as surface tension, I can remember times when I was very young where I didn't know about surface tension, but I would look at how the water would kind of like a muffin top, not spilling over the edges, but look at that and be like, wow, what's that? Just amazing. That's water. That is water right there. How can it go above the surface? Why doesn't it just strictly spill over the edges? Because it has cohesion. And you put water in with your flour, which is a classical example of this. You put water in with the flour to bind it. Water has this binding agent. And so water combined with our earth element keeps us together. It holds us together, right? So the fluidity, but also that element of cohesion. Fire element we can experience in ourselves as energy. The classical term is not energy, it's temperature, hot and cold. And when we think of ourselves as having the fire element in us, it's very clear when our body is really cold, like when it becomes the same temperature as the surrounding air. That is when we're passing on to the meditate on a decaying corpse, right? That's when we are not alive. We as living agents have fire element going all the time. You know, we are giving out heat. We are producing heat all the time. And it is escaping from us all the time, and we are producing more. So the fire element is alive in us as long as we are alive, right? And when we connect, you know, in a meditation practice, when we connect with the fire element, you know, we can sometimes focus on your belly, where we can feel like that's where the center of heat might come from, or we can just focus on the temperature. We can focus on the sensation of coldness against our skin, which tells us our skin is warmer than the surrounding air. So that's one way that we can have a direct experience of the fire element in our body. And, you know, when we think about the fire element in our body, we are also connecting this body that we have, which is a little sun producing heat all the time. We're suns in our own little worlds, you know, in our own scale. But, you know, this process that, you know, some incredible, whatever we're going to call it, not design, but some, you know, beautiful spark of intelligence or chaos, or however we want to describe it, had some cells learning that we can harvest the light that's coming from the sun and make things. We can, you know, these tiny engines, the energy of the sun harvested by plants. You know, the plants turned into other energy by those who eat the plants. This constant, you know, working of fire. So the fire element, when we experience it in ourselves, we are directly connecting to that same process all around us. And then air or wind, in Tibetan context, it's more often translated as wind because the description of it sounds more like wind, but it's also air, is motion. It's a quality of motion. And in our body, we can experience it in the easiest form as our breathing, the rise and fall, the motion of air coming in and out, which connects us also to the air element that's also outside us, but also the movement of circulation, the pumping of blood through our veins. That is the air element within us. So those four elements are the elements that we find in the four foundations of mindfulness, meditation on the body through four elements, and are also found in a lot of indigenous contexts. Other Buddhist sources add other elements to the discussion, and you find other Buddhist sources that speak of 5 elements and speak of 6 elements. And it kind of gets interesting here. The 5th element, what else is missing? Like in the material world, what we have all these 4 elements, what else do we need? We need space. We have space. And when we say we're mostly made up of water, not really. We're mostly made up of space. The space inside, if we boil it all down or compress it all down in some impossible way, it's mostly space here. So the space there are 2 kinds of space in Buddhist contexts. There is non-compounded space or unconditioned space and conditioned space. The space in the sense of emptiness between material particles is the conditioned kind of space, the space inside an empty bowl. But there's another way of thinking about space that's a little bit more fundamental, which is that my body is occupying space. There needed to be space here in order for my body to move into it. And that space exists whether something is occupying it or not. Does that make sense? It's like a very fundamentally different, it's not empty space, it's space itself. Space as the capacity to hold, for material to exist there. So that's a fifth element. And if we look at all of the elements that we have all material, all energy is all fitting in here. But if we look at the universe and everything that the universe contains, we're missing one really pretty fundamental element in Buddhist contexts. The sixth element is consciousness. Need consciousness to describe the totality of what we know and of what we are. So that is a sixth element in this presentation. And in that way, the idea is that a person is made up of these six elements. And I wonder if, I'm sure Jean must remember this. I don't know if Richard was there at this time or not, but when the school was offering, or when some of the teachers, i.e. you, were offering science classes to the Karmapa in Delhi and were presenting the table of elements, you had gone through all the elements and had them all laid out in front of him. And, this is an adult with, very, advanced formal classical training and not a single day of math or sciences in his life, asking, okay, these are all the elements. This describes everything that there is in the universe. How does that become this? What is that process? What happens? And, as it was reported to me by you, who were there, the answer was, we don't know. We don't know. But you have all the constitutive elements laid out right there. And so this is not a presentation to explain how things came into being. And it's not actually Buddha's explanation of what we are. That's not what he was doing with these practices. He was identifying the different elements of what we might think we are to tell us, you're not that. Don't identify yourself with that. So with a very particular purpose or end. And this presentation of all the elements of what we are kind of accordion unfolds the body. And so there are 5 elements that are describing our bodily existence. And then consciousness is one. The other main presentation of the elements that make up a person, which have the same purpose in the context where they appear, which is to help us to understand I am made up of non-me things. That is a presentation of the 5 skandhas, or the 5 aggregates, or the 5 heaps. And they are, body is just one. And then so the 5 elements, earth, water, fire, air or wind, and space get telescoped or compressed back into just body. And then the consciousness part is elaborated into sensation, what can be translated as discrimination, the way that we say not that, which is so fundamental to our evolutionary strategies and adaptiveness. Like, we can identify things and we can say, okay, that is poison, that is food. We can, have this ability to label things, to divide things up, to categorize them. So discernment. And then there's another category, which is kind of all of the other mental processes. It's called mental fabrications or formations. And then the 5th one is consciousness itself, this amazing thing, consciousness. So this is just to kind of look at these maps or these lists or ways of dividing into elements not because we are going to rely on them to understand who we are, but because in a meditative context, we have the opportunity to identify this in ourselves and use it as a pathway to experience all the rest of the world as made of the same elements as us, to re-evoke or reawaken our sense of connectedness. Does that make sense? And so I think the offer or the potential of the 4-element meditation is that when we sit, we are experiencing in our body directly the universe. When we understand the universe as composed of earth element, liquidity, water element, heat, energy, fire, and motion. When we have this present, that with this, the whole world is there. The whole world is made up of that, and I can connect with that directly in my body. And the earth element that is in me is not unique to me. It's not like the earth element in me operates differently or essentially could only belong to me ever. We are in constant processes of exchanging earth element and water element and fire element and wind element. And so the potential of this practice, is to use our own connection to our body, the own fact of embodiment, as a way of experiencing our interdependence or more precisely, our interconnectedness to everything that we might experience as other. So I think that's enough of an introduction to the meditation practice. Next comes actually doing it.